These are the ancient Israelites. Relentless warriors described in the Bible as soldiers of God. They are fierce, unwavering, and ruthless. Their leader is Joshua, a brilliant military strategist poised to bring the Israelites into the promised land, the land of Canaan. To fulfill this mission, Joshua and his army fight some of the most brutal battles described in the Bible. Perhaps none is more well known than the Battle of Jericho. An intricate tale of espionage, psychological warfare, and the extermination of an entire population. But Jericho is only the first in a long military campaign designed to conquer the land of Canaan. A campaign filled with blood and slaughter. Joshua's military might is first described in the Bible during the Great Exodus campaign out of Egypt in the 14th century BC. Soon after the Israelites cross the Sea of Reeds, they are ambushed by a Canaanite group called the Amalekites. The Israelite leader at the time is Moses. He handpicks his fiercest warrior, the young Joshua, to be his field commander. Joshua fights brilliantly and leads the Israelites to victory. But both he and Moses realize the Israelites need to be a more effective fighting force if they are going to invade and conquer Canaan and its dozens of fortified city-states.
The Israelites are light infantry guerrillas. They can't engage the enemy on the open plains. The Canaanites have chariots, and they could easily cut them down. So they stay in the desert for 40 years, creating a strong and more powerful army.
Joshua is impatient to invade Canaan, but accepts the wisdom of Moses, who believes the Israelites should stay in the desert longer and train a new and larger fighting force. After 40 years, the army's number swells to around 8,000. A force whose time has finally come. The first step is to leave their camp at Kadesh Barnea. But walled Canaanite cities block the route north. So Moses and Joshua lead some 35,000 men, women, and children south, then east into the Jordan Valley. The Israelites pass peacefully through the land of the Edomites and the Moabites. But soon they encounter an unfriendly tribe who refuse to let them pass, the Ammonites. In this first test of the newly trained Israelite army, Joshua shows he hasn't lost his military prowess and leads his army to victory. The Bible says Moses, Joshua, and the Israelites then attack several other tribes in the Jordan Valley on their way to Canaan. They marched on and went up the road to Bashan, and King Og of Bashan, with all his people, came out to engage them in battle. They defeated him and his sons and all his people until no remnant was left.
Why the need for this kind of brutality? And the answer from a military perspective is quite simply. The Israelites have no intention of living in the Jordan Valley. Their intention is to move their army to the border of Canaan, so that the area along the Jordan River becomes a strategic launching point for the future attack on Canaan. One cannot leave significant hostile forces in one's rear.
The Bible tells us that Moses dies before ever reaching the Promised Land. And God chooses Joshua to command the Israelites.
So far, it's taken 40 years and thousands of deaths to get to where Joshua and the Israelites are. But understanding where Joshua has been gives us a pretty good insight into what's coming next in his story. Because as difficult as it has been so far, the next part of getting to Canaan is going to be even bloodier.
Joshua, now solely in charge, develops a strategy to conquer Canaan. He needs to gain control of the mountain chain that runs through the center of the country.
Once on that mountain spine, he not only controls all the passes across the country, but he's free from counterattack from Canaanite armies, which are chariot heavy, whereas Israelite armies are essentially light infantry.
The Israelite army is perfectly suited for hit-and-run tactics over rugged terrain, and they're going to play to their strength.
Joshua calls together his 8,000 soldiers and announces the location of their first attack. It will be against one of the world's oldest cities, the fabled city of Jericho.
Joshua attacked Jericho because this is the first step in an Israelite war of extermination. The Israelites have no intention of settling in Canaan as long as there are other people still in Canaan. They intend to attack cities and drive them out and to replace their populations with their own. Jericho is fairly small, has a small population, almost defenseless.
But Jericho does have its famous walls, which are actually two walls about 12 feet apart that run parallel to each other. The walls are believed to be about 30 feet tall, stretching 1,400 yards around. Some of the people of Jericho live in the space between the two walls. Understanding the layout of Jericho is crucial to the success of overtaking the city.
He doesn't just stroll right in with his army. Like any good commander, he performs a reconnaissance of the objective. And here he sends 2 spies into the city of Jericho to check out its defenses and to see what else is going on.
He's taking this army into Canaan for the first time. The one thing he can't avoid is a defeat or a colossal screw-up. He wants to make sure that this becomes a military success.
The spies sneak inside Jericho and head to a brothel. A cunning decision.
Choice of an inn or house of prostitution is absolutely brilliant. This is a small city. Strangers would immediately be recognized. The only place they could, if not hide, but have a good excuse for being there would be in a house of prostitution. That's also where tongues wag a lot. And a lot of loose gossip could be picked up about troop dispositions, morale, etc.
They find a prostitute willing to help them. Her name is Rahab.
Rahab tells the Israelite spies about the conditions in Jericho. And what's very clear is that the morale of the people is shot. The tales of great slaughter during the Jordanian campaign have reached their ears. So they're literally scared to death that they're going to be attacked.
The Bible states that Rahab lives in between the parallel walls.
Now, this is important because, as we'll see, there are some who believe that the location of Rahab's house is the key to how the Battle of Jericho went down.
It's now dark, and the Israelite spies are prepared to leave Jericho and to return to Joshua with their intelligence report.
But their cover is blown.
The king of Jericho's intelligence service picks up the fact that the Israelite spies are in the city and track them to Rahab's apartment and go to Rahab and demand she turn over the Israelite spies.
According to the Bible, Rahab covers for the Israelites. It is true, she said, the men did come to me, but I didn't know where they were from. And at dark, when the gate was about to be closed, the men left, and I don't know where the men went. Quick, go after them, for you can overtake them.
And apparently, they're happy with his explanation. One assumes they might have done a search, but given Rahab's profession, she was probably pretty persuasive. So, where were the spies? Well, the Bible tells us she actually hid them on the roof.
Now, under the cover of darkness, the spies must escape the city and return to Joshua.
But before they go, they say to Rahab, because you have helped us, when the attack comes to the city, we want you and your family to be spared. So in order that we know that this is your house, take a red cord and tie it to the window and no harm will come to you or your family.
Rahab ties the red cord in the window, and the spies slide down the rope on the outside of the wall. The men report to Joshua with important intelligence. Jericho's small population is terrified and therefore vulnerable. The information gives Joshua the confidence that now is the time to attack the city. Joshua leads his army across the Jordan River toward Jericho.
This is a big army. Our estimates are 8,000 to 9,000 men, one of the largest armies that's ever been put to the field in Canaan.
Inside the walls, the citizens of Jericho were terrified. Here comes the army they've heard about that has just slaughtered their way through the Jordan Valley.
Jericho is a small city, only about 8 acres, roughly the size of 8 football fields.
To estimate the population of ancient Jericho, based on the rough benchmark historians use of about 240 inhabitants per urban acre times about 8.5 acres, you arrive at a population of about 2,500, somewhere in there, about 20%, which can be mustered to defend the city.
The perimeter walls are almost a mile in circumference.
So you have an army outside of 8,000 to 9,000 men surrounding a city that can mount no more than 500 defenders on the walls. That's about 1 every 3 meters. The Israelite army could encircle Jericho, one with a man 1 meter apart, 6 men deep.
But this huge army doesn't attack. For 6 days, Joshua marches his men around Jericho.
The biblical description of the plan seems on the face of it absurd. According to the Bible, Yahweh says to Joshua, "You shall march around the city for 6 days."
According to the Bible, on the 7th day, the Israelites are supposed to blow their shofars, or battle horns.
And the walls shall come tumbling down. And everyone knows the old song of Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down.
Joshua commanded the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." At the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so every man charged straight in, and they took the city. The walls fall down, and Jericho's defenses crumble. Is it a miracle? Or is there another explanation? The walls of Jericho come tumbling down. Joshua and the Israelites have their first victory in Canaan.
But there's got to be a more pragmatic military explanation, and I think the Bible actually reveals it if you know where to look. And the secret is Rahab the prostitute.
Remember how the Israelite spies got out of Rahab's apartment? She let them down on a rope that she had. They also told her to tie a red cord to the windowsill. And the reason for that, ostensibly, was that the Israelite army would know that this was her apartment and no harm would come to her.
But once inside the city walls, the Israelite soldiers obviously won't be able to see a marker visible only from the outside.
So now you have to ask, what is a red cord signifying hanging from a window 2 or 3 stories up the wall? And I think that's the answer to how the walls came tumbling down.
The red cord may be a signal, but if the story is looked at from a military perspective, a completely different motivation becomes apparent.
What if the red cord is not there to say, hey, don't attack us? What if it's an invitation up? Who's to say that Rahab doesn't lower the same rope out the window that the spies used to climb down? But now Israelite soldiers are climbing up it.
The Israelite army creates the perfect cover for these soldiers by marching around the city perimeter and loudly blowing their battle horns.
When the noise was going on, it would have been a simple task to take 8, 10, 12 guys at a time and climb up the rope, using the red cord as an indicator of where her apartment was, and hide in her apartment or on the roof. For 6 days, 10 men at a time, give or take, at 50, 60 special ops guys are now inside the wall.
On the 7th day, the army is still marching around the city. Joshua gives the command, and once again the Israelites blow their horns, one last time.
What that noise was probably a signal to the special ops guys. And what they would have done is emerge from hiding quickly
and attacked the defenders from the inside, threw open the gate, and the walls came tumbling down.
Given that there were so many men outside relative to the number of defenders, they could have easily cleared a section of the wall. This would have made it easy for Israelite soldiers to scale up over the top, and the walls, metaphorically speaking, would have come tumbling down.
With the city firmly in Joshua's hands, what he does next has actually horrified people who read the Bible. He puts the entire city to the sword. The term in Hebrew is kol ha-nesama, to go up upon the city and to kill every breathing thing.
The massacre is up close and personal.
This is a war of extermination. Joshua is sending a message to the other kings of Canaan. This is your fate if you do not leave. They killed every man, every woman, every child, every goat, every sheep, every jackass, literally every living thing. And then they burn the city. It's a horrible, horrible fate that he visited upon the poor people of Jericho. Joshua is a fine tactician and a fine strategist. But one suspects as well that he's also a God-intoxicated man. He's prepared to visit this horror on a completely innocent population in order to achieve not only military goals, but perhaps to achieve the promise of Yahweh that you shall go upon the land of Canaan and take those cities that I have given you for your inheritance. Well, the price of the inheritance, in human terms anyway, is very high indeed.
But the bloodshed has only just begun. Joshua's reason for destroying Jericho was primarily psychological. Strategy determines his next target. The city of Bethel, about 10 miles north of modern Jerusalem, controls a key pass into the mountains. From here, Joshua can begin to control the central mountain spine of Canaan.
Bethel represents one of the few places on the spine where an invading force can grab a foothold. So they need that pass before Joshua can put the rest of his strategy in effect by being able to move onto the spine itself, move in both directions, and neutralize all the Canaanite city-states.
Before Joshua's 8,000-man army moves ahead, he sends a small reconnaissance force to Bethel. On their way, they come across an urban ruin called Ai.
Ai was a highly fortified town about 1,000 years earlier. But during Joshua's time, it's just a ruin. But the ruin plays an important role in the next phase of Joshua's conquest.
Joshua's recon team reports that Bethel and Ai will be easy to defeat.
And they give him the advice not to send the whole army up to the ruin because there's not much point to it.
Trusting the information, Joshua sends only a small force of about 600 men to Ai. He has no idea that the Bethelite army lies hidden in the ruin.
At Ai, Joshua makes one of the few rare mistakes. The function of a reconnaissance platoon is to report the situation on the ground, not to make operational suggestions.
While the rest of the platoon remains outside, a small reconnaissance team enters the ruin.
What probably happened is the place looks deserted and they stumble into the ruin and they're ambushed.
Most of the reconnaissance team is slaughtered. The remaining Israelite platoon outside the ruin panics and retreats. The ambush at Ai becomes Joshua's first defeat. Joshua's victory at Jericho is blunted in Ai, where the Israelites suffer their first defeat since they invaded Canaan. A small platoon of Israelite soldiers are ambushed and then slaughtered by a Canaanite group called the Bethelites.
Now, it's interesting what Joshua does, or what's going through his mind at this time. He's concerned not so much about the small battlefield defeat, but he's concerned about the effect on the psychology of the Canaanites. He had destroyed the city of Jericho to send a psychological shockwave through the Canaanite city-states, and now his own forces have been defeated. So the Bible tells us he's concerned that he had lost that psychological advantage. And so in order to compensate, he quickly decides to move into the attack.
The next morning, Joshua mobilizes his entire 8,000-man army and marches them to Ai.
Joshua's march on Ai takes most of the day, and they arrive at dusk. The army maneuvers into a position behind some hills to the east of the urban ruin.
Between Joshua's army and Ai is a shallow valley in the shape of a saddle. Joshua sets up the Israelite camp so it's out of view of the Bethelites. After surveying the ruin himself, he understands how his men were ambushed. The ruins of Ai make a chaotic battlefield, 14 acres of rubble enclosed by a collapsed wall. It's a jumble of debris and caved-in buildings, perfect ambush territory.
If you looked at the city of Fallujah after the Marine Division got through with it, we look like that. So you can see the tactical advantage is that you can spread your troops, even a small number of troops, in that urban environment where they can take advantage of that rubble. It means your adversary cannot bring his numbers to bear as he can in the open field. He's got to funnel them down little corridors where they're subject to hand-to-hand combat.
Joshua sets a new plan into motion, one that shows off his tactical brilliance. It will be a deception that will draw the Bethelites into committing a military blunder.
He immediately sizes up the situation and understands that the army that is in Ai is probably most of the army from Bethel, but not all of it. And so if he decides to attack that ruin, he's going to leave his flank or even his rear open up to a possible relief column moving down the road from Bethel.
Instead of attacking the Bethelites in the ruin, Joshua positions some of his troops on the plain in front of the ruin, challenging the Bethelites to fight in the open.
But he only lines up about 1,000 of his men. One can imagine the Bethelite commander saying, "This whole Israelite threat has been overblown with the siege of Jericho. This is all they can muster? We can deal with this."
But what the Bethelite commander doesn't understand is that Joshua has left several thousand soldiers out of sight in the back of the hills. He's also concealed another special operations force of a few thousand on the other side of Bethel. Convinced that their 2,500-man army can easily beat this small Israelite force they see in front of them, the Bethelites move most of their fighters out of the ruin and onto the plain,
thus giving up the tactical advantage of the defense in the ruins where they would have had the advantage of ambush and hand-to-hand combat.
The two armies battle on the open plain.
It's blood, hair, and eyeballs up close, and the battle rages.
The bronze sickle sword is the primary weapon of both armies. Its foot-long blade and handles are cast from a single solid piece of bronze for extra strength. Both also carry 6-foot-long wooden spears. Thrusting weapons are tipped with sharpened bronze. The Israelites also use slings that turn small rocks into deadly projectiles that kill like bullets. Quickly, the battlefield at Ai becomes a death zone. The Israelites, still standing on the battlefield, are overwhelmed and retreat.
Now, at this point, the Bethelites, of course, break into a run and begin to pursue. But the real interesting fact is that the reserve units that the Bethelites had left behind in Ai also abandon the ruin and begin to join in the pursuit, figuring to catch up with the Israelites and make a great slaughter of it all and put this vague Israelite threat of invasion to rest once and for all.
As Joshua reaches the top of the hill, he stops, turns, and flashes his sickle sword in the sun, sending a signal to 1,000 Israelites hidden west of the ruin. As soon as he held out his hand, the ambush came rushing out of their station.
Joshua signals the force, and they come out of their hidden position and burn the Bethelite camp in Ai to the ground.
Now you have the Bethelites on the open plain look to their rear, and their camp is on fire. They now realize that they're caught from behind as well.
But Joshua is not finished. He flashes another signal, this time to the main body of his army, about 5,000 soldiers. They've been waiting behind the ridge.
One can only imagine the terror of Bethelite soldiers as suddenly an enormous host of 4,000 to 5,000 men who had been hidden to this time appears over the edge of the saddle and now begins with Joshua's forces, who turn around, join up, and begin to attack downhill.
The Bethelites are caught between two Israelite forces. Outnumbered 3 to 1, the Bethelites are trapped and slaughtered. At the Battle of Ai, the Israelite military commander Joshua uses superior battlefield tactics to defeat a Canaanite group called the Bethelites.
What Joshua does at Ai is he bluffs. He doesn't show his full hand, and he gets his opponent to go all in. And then he takes him for all he's worth.
We'll see throughout Joshua's life these indications of a brilliant tactician, of an individual, and strategist, of an individual who has a firm grasp of military reality.
The Israelites are experienced warriors who have numbers, and Joshua, a brilliant commander, in their favor.
The result is an absolute slaughter. The Bethelites are quickly enveloped, and they're just massacred.
Joshua orders the extermination of all of them. And again, you see what Joshua is doing. You know, it's a very cruel story, but he has a dual purpose here. One, again, he wants to regain that psychological edge by striking terror in the remaining Canaanite kings. Secondly, he cannot simply allow the Bethelite forces to remain behind his line of communication. They all have to die, and they all do.
And that includes the Bethelite king, who is captured alive. Joshua orders his men to bring the king to the gates of Bethel, where he is hanged. He hung the king on a tree and left him there until evening. With the public execution of the Bethelite king and its army destroyed, the strategic city of Bethel surrenders.
Joshua's tactical brilliance really shines at the Battle of Ai. If he had presented his entire army in front of the city, the Bethelites would never have come out and taken them on the open battlefield. They would have clearly seen, they would have been overpowered, and they would have hunkered down inside the city. And then he would have been caught up in this slow battle of attrition, and that's something Joshua couldn't afford. He couldn't afford to lose time or men.
So Joshua now has regained the strategic initiative and tactical initiative. He's destroyed Jericho. He's moved his army successfully to grab the opening to the mountain spine, which runs longitudinally in Israel. And he also has a psychological edge reestablished again. Once more, he has struck fear in the hearts of the Canaanite kings, whose kingdoms guard that mountainous ridge that is the prime strategic target of Joshua's military operations.
Joshua's next move is diplomatic. He convinces Canaanite tribes in the mountains to join the Israelites as allies.
These are tribes that are armed with their own military forces, much like the Israelites are. And they're outside the influence of the Canaanite city-states. This conveys upon him an enormous military advantage. First of all, now, he can move along the spine, at least to the north, without having to deal with these tribes. They're now his allies. Secondly, they make his logistics easier. They too have supply depots. They too have crops and animals that he can draw on.
They have no vested interest, of course, in protecting the Canaanite states. So they sign on to Joshua's army as mercenaries.
Using population data, we can estimate that Joshua's army at Jericho was about 8,000 men. And while the Bible doesn't tell us how many additional men were added here, it's not unlikely that it was at least 3,000 to 4,000. So now you're looking at a military force with a manpower strength of about 12,000 soldiers.
With his strengthened army, Joshua marches to his next target, Gibeon, a walled mountain city that's strategically located. Gibeon controls a key east-west pass and a major north-south trading route.
Here is where Joshua cashes in his psychological chips. The word of the slaughter of Jericho and at Ai has reached Gibeon. As the Bible tells us, they were frightened to death. They suggest to Joshua, there's no need for a battle here. We'll become your allies.
Joshua's plan is falling into place. He signs a pact with Gibeon and adds their fighting force to the Israelites. Together, they cut off important Canaanite trade routes on the central mountain spine of the country.
This is not a situation that the Canaanite kings can tolerate for very long. And so the Jebusite king of Jerusalem, Adonizek, sends a message to the 5 other great kings of the area to come up and join me against Gibeon. And the armies of all 5 kings begin to converge on Gibeon, and they surround it and bring it under siege.
The 5 Canaanite kings command a combined force of nearly 15,000 men. They are a powerful army of heavily armored infantry and chariots. Outgunned and surrounded, the Gibeonites send a message to Joshua about the siege. The people of Gibeon thereupon sent this message to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal. Do not fail your servants. Come up quickly and aid us and deliver us, for all the Amorite kings of the hill country have gathered against us. Joshua honors the pact. It's only been 2 months since the Battle of Ai, but the Israelite military machine is on the move again. They begin an 18-mile night march across some of the most rugged terrain in all of Canaan.
Going from Gilgal to Gibeon, you climb 1,500 feet in altitude. And you're talking about moving a large amount of people, upwards of 12,000, through very rocky terrain, and doing it all with command and control in order to bring that force into position where it can strike and do so by achieving tactical surprise.
At some point in the middle of the night, the Israelites reach the east side of Gibeon.
To understand what's going on, you have to understand the kind of topography in which Gibeon is located. Gibeon is actually located in a valley, but in the center of the valley is the Reis Nal, and the city is located on the Reis Nal.
The combined Canaanite armies surround Gibeon in the valley below.
Joshua's army arrives behind the hills outside of Gibeon at about 3 o'clock in the morning. They're exhausted from the march. They're hungry, they're thirsty. But
They can't have fires to warm themselves. They can't have fires to cook. They can't even make a lot of noise. And the reason is they're essentially at the final coordination line before going into the attack.
Joshua designs a clever new battle plan that combines the element of surprise with a precise timing for his attack.
Any noise, any mistake, any braying of a donkey, certainly any firewood, would give away their position and completely squander the advantage of tactical surprise that Joshua has worked so hard to bring about.
Many historians believe that Joshua waits until the break of dawn to launch his attack.
The Bible says that Joshua prayed to the Lord to make the sun stand still.
Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, "O sun, stand still over Gibeon. O moon, over the valley of Elon." So the sun stood still and the moon stopped. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a man.
What probably happened in just physical terms was that we've all seen early morning where the sun is coming up and the moon is still present in the sky. And that's apparently what happened. It gives us an idea of the time of day at which this thing was fought.
The time of day is crucial because he's using a force of nature as an ally, the sun.
Joshua leads this army up over the hills and strikes downhill with the sun at his back. Takes the Canaanite armies who were still in their camp, still having breakfast, still in their tents half asleep, and just smashes into them.
The carnage begins. Sunrise. Joshua and the Israelite army attack Canaanite forces near the town of Gibeon.
Here come 12,000 screaming Israelites down a hill at full speed. You can imagine a Canaanite soldiers awakened by the screams of battle, stumbling out of their tent with no armor, no weapons, and then looking up, trying to gain their senses about them, only to be blinded by the low-lying sun shining right into their eyes. And behind the hot spots in their eyes is nothing but Israelite swords.
The Canaanites are unarmed, half asleep, and temporarily blinded. Joshua has rendered his enemy defenseless.
We see again his knowledge of terrain and tactics. Joshua, the hills surround all of Gibeon. He could have put this army anywhere. He put it in a position so that when the sun rose in the morning, it would be at his back. Plus, he'd be attacking downhill against an enemy that had not yet been fed or even fully awake, taking advantage of all about terrain, geography, and even the movement of the sun, and bringing them all to bear as advantages on one tactical objective.
It's wholesale slaughter. Those who aren't killed run. But there is no escape. The Israelites hunt them down, determined to leave no survivors.
What Joshua has in mind is nothing less than the extermination of some of the most powerful of the armies of some of the most powerful city-states in all Canaan. They're not going to live to fight another day. They keep chasing and pursuing the Canaanites who are fleeing in all directions until sunset. Then they rest that evening, get up at the crack of dawn again, and continue the pursuit. Talking about an infantry force that moved 30 miles in 48 hours, 2/3 of the time being engaged in combat. That's a magnificent military achievement for any military force, even a modern one. But to see this done in the days of the Bible really gives a kind of sense of how militarily sophisticated a commander like Joshua was. He fought one of the greatest and most studied battles in the history of the world.
It's a crucial strategic victory for the Israelites and a critical turning point in Joshua's invasion of Canaan.
At this point, Joshua has achieved many of his strategic objectives. He's in control of the central mountain spine. He has either made agreements with or destroyed major Canaanite city-states on that spine. So for the most part, Joshua succeeded.
According to the Bible, Joshua goes on to defeat dozens of Canaanite kingdoms, but he fails to capture all of the Promised Land.
At the end of the day, Joshua simply lacks both the size and mix of force that would make it possible to bring about the complete conquest of Canaan and its resettlement by the Israelites. The result is that even as the Bible tells the story, Joshua was never able to do this, and he dies a rather bitter man.
Toward the end of his life, Joshua retires from combat and fades into anonymity.
And he was buried alone on a place which translates from Hebrew, Angry Mountain. And it is said in the Bible that no one attended his funeral. And it's one of an unfitting end for one of history's great commanders.
More than 300 years later, Joshua's bloody conquest of the Promised Land, and particularly the Battle of Jericho, remain one of the Bible's most popular tales.
There's a certain mythology about Jericho. It has all the elements of a great thriller. There's spies, psychological warfare, there's strategy, suspense, and of course violence. It stays with you.
The story of Jericho has been burned into the human consciousness. When you think about the wholesale slaughter of civilian population, presumably with God's blessing, it raises some deep questions about what that says about the Bible.
Joshua's military strategies of encirclement and psychological warfare echo throughout history.
In April 1975, the army of communist North Vietnam, under the command of the famous general Nguyen Giap, was closing in from all sides on the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. Ahead of the armed forces were a wave of rumors that were sapping the will of Saigon's people to fight.
Like Joshua, Giap encircles Saigon with his troops. He basically ties a noose around the city and slowly tightens it. At the same time, Giap's reputation precedes him. The people of Saigon remember his Tet Offensive 7 years earlier, with mass executions of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians.
Some say that the Viet Cong had operatives in Saigon in 1975 who helped to feed the rumor mill, building up the horrors that would befall the civilian population, like people getting their nails yanked out and other torture. Just awful stuff.
Joshua is best known as the man who brought the Israelites home to the Promised Land of Canaan, a land that continues to be drenched in blood.
Ancient Canaan comprises what is today Israel and the occupied territories. The land disputes are still ongoing. Blood is still being shed. 3,500 years after Joshua first led the Israelites into what is to be their biblical home, a legacy of violence endures in the Promised Land.
It was God who promised the land to the Israelites, but it was a man who ultimately brought his people home. The cunning and brutal military genius